Hi, Edward Funk, and this is podcast number 70, uh, titled Bette Davis, called Loretta Young, a chocolate covered widow spider. But before we get in, uh, note what is, I think, 13 books back there. These are all books that I've written. And seeing them from a distance, as you must think, oh, how do I get a hold of them? Well, go on Amazon. They're all available. Okay. Now, these podcasts that I'm doing now is from a copywritten book. Uh, you kind of see the pink one back there, called Behind the Door, The Real Story of Loretta Young. Okay. David Selznick had asked Loretta to test for Gone with the Wind. Loretta responded, I said, no, I wouldn't be right for it, David. You'll end up wanting me to play Melanie, and I'm not going to play a second lead to anybody. And looking at the 20 years remaining in her career, she never did. Now, the next several podcasts are going to deal with Loretta's relationship with Tom Lewis. I get it. He's not Spencer Tracy, Clark Gable, or Tyrone Power. But stick with these new podcasts. Tom Lewis had an unbelievable ego, and that will provoke some amazing stories. You know, in writing my novels, so much fun to to write about characters with oversized egos. I mean, they say the most outrageous things, and yet they're insensitive to everybody else, but hypersensitive to their own feelings. They're hilarious. Anyway, I'll continue going. Loretta was doing a lot of radio and agreed to appear on an early episode of the Screen Guild Theater, which premiered on CBS Radio in January 1939. Tom Lewis, the 37-year-old fair-haired boy of Young and Rubicon's radio department, that's an advertising agency, was the producer. In these salad days of radio, the advertising agencies were very powerful, not only representing the sponsor, but actually producing the radio shows. And Young and Rubicon was one of the country's top agencies. A meeting was arranged to discuss the script, and to accommodate Loretta's schedule, it was agreed to meet at her home, Loretta recalled. I was doing a portrait sitting that day with my three sisters. This was a picture that they used to promote the story of Alexander Graham Bell, in which Loretta played Mrs. Bell, and Loretta's biological sisters played her sisters in the movie. Anyway, this is Loretta again. The butler led Tom and his entourage past us and into the living room, closing the doors behind him. Now, when I finished, I joined them. Tom was there with assistants. Advertising people always run in packs. Plus, there were my agents, 5 or 6 people altogether. I found Tom very interesting. He was bright, and he was the boss of the whole thing. He did a lot of talking, and he talked well. He had a lovely smile, and I was attracted to him right away. 2 or 3 days later, I asked my radio agent, why don't you ask Mr. Lewis to join us for lunch? He arranged for Tom to meet us at the Brown Derby. Tom was late. In fact, he didn't show up. And he asked for a rain check for the following day, only to be late again. Loretta, quoting Loretta, I realized that he had a lot of things to do besides going to lunch with the leading lady. Now, here's my voice. I learned about Tom Lewis, and the more I realized how manipulative he was, I think he was very much playing games with his 2 no-shows. He wanted to establish how important he was, right, in disguise. And boy, will you learn more. broadcasts. Tom was still based in New York, and Loretta started dating frequently when he was in California. Loretta wasn't Tom's first movie star girlfriend. He had a very close relationship with actress Glenda Farrell in New York, and he had dated Bette Davis on previous forays to the West Coast. Betty was to read in the newspaper that Tom Lewis and Loretta were an item. Reacting, Bette Davis dubbed Loretta a chocolate-covered widow spider. When Loretta heard about this, she said, I didn't like it, but I understood it. It had happened 2 or 3 times. She'd been seeing someone, George Brent, for instance. Then I'd meet him, and I'd soon be dating him. So it was with Spencer Tracy and Tom Lewis. Now, who was this guy who came swooping into Hollywood to attract the attention of its most fascinating women? Tom's father was Welsh, his mother Irish. When Tom Lewis was a young boy in Troy, New York, his policeman father sought the position of police chief. The local Democratic political machine had initially promised their support, but then threw their weight behind the opposing candidate. Some years later, Sergeant Jim Lewis sought the appointment a second time, only to have the original scenario repeated. The whole family felt betrayed. It's an important anecdote because it explains why Tom, even with the benefit of his Celtic charm that he had cultivated, even when he had appeared so successful, he continued to have a chip on his soldier. Soldier, there we go. Now, Tom had 2 older brothers, plus an older and younger sister. He often escaped across the street to the Perry house, quite the contrast to the Lewis's rented home. It was one of the largest houses in town, and it included a library. Miss Perry, a spinster caring for her aging mother, became quite fond of Tom, and through her books introduced him to faraway places. Tom admired the people in those stories. What they did and how they lived seemed so much more important than the activities of working-class Troy. Tom worked his way through Union College at Schenectady, New York, collecting delinquent payments for the Singer Sewing Machine Company. I give him credit for that. That could not have been an easy job, collecting for anything. Upon graduation, he headed for New York and tried his hand at acting and playwright. He returned to Schenectady 3 years later, where he wrote, produced, and played in a 15-minute serial broadcast 3 times weekly. His responsibilities expanded to include being the station's announcer and the male lead of a weekly soap opera. 6 years later, Tom moved over to NBC, own radio station in Cleveland, Ohio. His producing talents were soon recognized by the parent company, and he became the station's program director. He then set his eyes on Young and Rubicon in New York. He realized working for a major agency was the way to the top of the radio world in the 1930s. Now, here's a little Jim Backus anecdote. Do you remember him from Mr. Magoo and Gilligan's Island? Anyway, the president of the agency, we're back to Young and Rubicon, was Chet LaRocque, and he liked Tom and hired him. Oh, you know what? Let me back up. I just wrote in my notes the Jim Backus anecdote, and then I assumed that I wrote more about it. But that anecdote was when Tom left Cleveland to go to New York. Jim Backus, I believe, was from Cleveland. The two of them rode out together. That's all there is to that. Okay. So Tom got the job at Young and Rubicon, and he was the producer for the Kate Miss Show. Kate Smith show. Um, and Tom soon became production supervisor of all the agency's radio programs. So, again, give him credit. He's moving on up. Tom, now in his early 30s, was a handsome man with dark eyes and wavy brown hair. He parlayed his good looks by dressing exquisitely and established a smart address at the Russell Hotel on Park Avenue. He escorted his dates to nightclubs where one was noticed, and his name soon began popping up in the gossip columns as a man about town. Actress Glenda Farrell was the most famous of his dates, and they became a steady item. The more Loretta learned about Tom, the more impressed she became. He was Catholic and seemed to know a lot about his religion, and she was fascinated that this man about town was also on a spiritual quest. The romance prospered even though it was a long distance one. Loretta recalled either Tom had some project to do out here, or he'd fly out maybe once a month and for 3 or 4 days. Then we'd write romantic letters back and forth, and it was all kind of make believe. Again, this is me. Let's note that Loretta was once again falling into the trap of a long distance romance, even after the disaster of her long distance romance with Bill Buckner, who ended up going to prison as a fraud. Okay, now this is Loretta. Reflecting back, she admitted that she was feeling pressure. I was sick and tired of reading in the paper, oh, poor Loretta, her romantic life is doomed. Here she's 27 years old and there's no man in her life. She also knew that she could only be happy in a marriage blessed by her church, which is the Catholic Church. Loretta recalled, Tom had asked me to marry him and I accepted him, but Mama had not given the engagement party yet. So we were going to a Sunday afternoon cocktail party. While we were driving there, I said, Tom, are you sure enough that you're in love with me to stay married to me for the rest of your life? He said, yes, indeed, aren't you? I said, well, no, I don't know. I mean, not for sure. I mean, well, then he just hit the ceiling. I meant it as a serious and important question for both of us. I didn't realize at the time that his ego was bigger than anything else. He said, I'm going to tell you something. I'm going to be difficult enough to be married to you if you're madly in love with me, and if you aren't, forget it. We arrived at our house, and Tom leaned over and opened the car door. I got out, and he, simply nonplussed, closed the door and drove off. I was very hurt and upset because there was nothing. There was absolutely no understanding on his part of what I meant. What I meant was, I'm a movie actress, and that wouldn't be easy for any man. Are you really enough in love with me? Because when we're married, that's it. Both of us are Catholic, and we can't marry anybody else. I gathered myself and went in and explained that Tom would be back in a few minutes. He'd gone to get cigarettes. Somebody was leaving a half hour later, and I asked, would you mind dropping me at home? I've got a big headache, and so when Tom comes, uh, tell him meet me at my house. Tom never came, and he didn't call for 2 or 3 days. Almost through with this one. When he called, he said, I don't know what got into me. I said, well, I don't think you're sure, and I don't think I'm sure. So let's just let things go for a while. He said, well, fine. When I come out, I'll call you. The press knew everything in this town, so quite soon they were saying, oh, poor Loretta, she's not engaged anymore. The period when Tom and Loretta were dating overlapped with the time that Loretta was also seeing Jimmy Stewart. She recalled, one time I walked into some restaurant on the strip with Jimmy, and Tom was there with somebody else. Tom came over to the table and said, I thought you were going out of town. I said I was. And Jimmy said, so what? His voice rising, sounding just like he did in one of his movies. Jimmy was playing the field, but it was always very special when he asked me out. I could have been seriously interested in him. In fact, I was crazy about him. I prayed for a long time that Jimmy would ask me to marry him, but he didn't. Okie doke. We'll continue with podcast 71 next week. Thank you.